The most famous game is called a prisoner's dilemma game. In the prisoner's dilemma game, you basically have two criminals who have been picked up on a relatively petty charge, but there is a suspicion that they've been involved in something more nefarious. Now, in order for this game to reach a conclusion, the two prisoners are split up and they are told essentially the same story, that they can help the prosecutor by turning state's evidence, or they can keep quiet. The payoffs for the two players will be dependent upon how each player responds to the offer of the district attorney. So here we have a playoff matrix. We put player A on the left and his two options, which is either to cooperate with the prosecution or to not cooperate, which basically means to keep his mouth shut. Player B and his options are listed along the top of the box. The payoffs go within each section of the overall matrix. Now, if both players turn state's evidence, they're cooperating, then there's evidence enough to convict them of a more serious charge. Both criminal would get 5 years. If they keep their mouths shut, they'll go to jail for the petty crime, and both players would get 2 years. Now, if this was the end of the game, it's obvious which choice should be made. Both players should keep their mouths shut because it leads to fewer years in jail. However, the open boxes here represent where the dilemma comes in. If one player cooperates with the prosecutor and one player does not, then the payoffs change. What we see here is that the one player, player A, decides to cooperate. He gets a break and only gets 1 year. He turns state's evidence. Player B, unfortunately, at least for player B, ends up with 10 years because he keeps his mouth shut and now he's going down the river. The other box reverses that scenario, where player B cooperates and gets the 1 year, and player A gets 10 years. The dilemma is what to do. And what we'll see here is that the inevitable outcome of the game is that both players end up confessing, and they both end up with 5-year terms, even though they could have ended up with 2-year terms. The question is why? And the answer that we get from game theory is that both criminals have what's called a dominant strategy. A dominant strategy is a strategy in a game where no matter what the other person does, you will do one single thing only because it benefits you. If player B decides that they're not going to cooperate no matter what, player A is either going to get 2 years or 1 year. Since player A would prefer 1 year, the only way to get to that outcome is if player A cooperates with the prosecutor. Now, if player B can actually convince player A that the only thing that they would ever do would be to cooperate with the prosecution, then player A's best outcome would be also to cooperate, because in that case he gets 5 years. If player B is going to cooperate and player A is not, then he would get 10 years. So no matter what player B does, whether they cooperate or whether they don't cooperate, the best thing for player A is to cooperate, because they'll get fewer years in jail. That's what we mean by a dominant strategy. No matter what the other player does, this is what player A will do. Player B's position is very similar. If player A says, I am going to keep my mouth shut no matter what, you can take it to the bank, then player B would be in their best interests to cooperate, because they would get 1 year instead of 2. Now, if player A says, I will squeal like a pig, I'm going to tell him everything I know, no matter what happens, then player B would also be well served to confess, because they would get 5 years instead of 10. That's the dominant strategy for player B. Since both players have a dominant strategy, the solution to the game is very simple. You go to the box where their dominant strategies prevail, where they intersect, which is for both of them to confess, and they both end up with 5 years, even though they could have ended up with 2. But remember, these are criminals. You can't really trust them to keep their word, so you would never trust your fellow criminal to keep his mouth shut. You're both going to confess because that's your dominant strategy. Whenever you have 2 dominant strategies like that, we say that there is a Nash equilibrium. A Nash equilibrium occurs when there's no way for one player to unilaterally improve themselves. If we're at the confess box and player A changes his mind, he can't improve himself. If we're in the both keep your mouth shut box, however, one of those players could change their mind and improve themselves. Player A could say, well, if you're going to keep your mouth shut, I'm going to change my mind, I'm going to confess, and he would get less time. That's why the 2-2 box is not a Nash equilibrium. Anyway, game theory can be relatively complex. This is the most common game that you'll see, the prisoner's dilemma game, and it can be applied in a variety of circumstances. But these are the basics of game theory and the basics of the prisoner's dilemma.